On the 24th of February 2022, mere hours after Russian President Vladimir Putin had announced his country's special military operation in Ukraine, Russian troops from the airborne forces descended on Antonov Airport in the rural settlement of Hostomel. Despite the small size of the town, Russian forces wished to capture its strategic position just northwest of the Ukrainian capital of Kiev, where additional equipment could be airlifted in order to target larger settlements. While this was the very first large-scale engagement of the Russo-Ukrainian War, the Ukrainians had prepared well for a counterattack, and soon both Antonov Airport and the surrounding town of Hostomel were transformed into a battlefield. Across the months that followed, Hostomel would change hands more than once, and Russia would send in wave after wave of military personnel. Tanks, attack helicopters, and hundreds of troops would swarm the settlement as the Ukrainians attempted to defend their position and their country. But how exactly did the battles at Antonov Airport and the subsequent conflict around Hostomel play out? How did the Ukrainians respond to the first few hours of the Russian invasion? And what became of Hostomel after the Russians attempted to take it? Today, we'll be aiming to answer all these questions and more as we explore the tense and terrifying reality behind those all-important first few hours, days, and weeks of the Russo-Ukrainian War. Welcome to Wars of the World. For almost a year prior to the invasion of Ukraine, Russian forces had been amassing military equipment and troops close to the land border that they shared with their target. Satellite images picked up the movement of heavy weapons, including missiles and armoured convoys not far from the outskirts of Ukrainian lands, which of course caught the attention of international governments. It was becoming clear that a potential invasion was imminent, and as such, Ukraine began to prepare for the worst-case scenario. Amongst those on the international stage who'd been keeping a close watch on Russia's movements in mid to late 2021 were the United States CIA. William J. Burns, who at the time directed the CIA, made a journey to Ukraine in January of 2022, with intelligence that Russian forces were indeed planning on targeting specifically the Antonov Airport and the adjacent settlement of Hostomel. Before we continue, let's take a look at Hostomel and its airport. Hostomel, located in north-central Ukraine, might not look like the site of a major military operation at first glance. As of 2022, a little over 18,000 people called this town home, many of whom made a living for themselves in the nearby capital city of Kiev, as well as in local industries of glassmaking, and of course at the Antonov Airport. The otherwise sleepy countryside town is in fact best known for its airport, which serves as an international cargo transport hub and a facility for testing aircraft. The world's largest cargo plane, the Antonov An-225 Maria, was housed at the airport at the time of the invasion, and it would be just one of the craft here that would be destroyed by the ensuing fighting. The Ukrainian military's air force also frequented Antonov Airport for the transportation of their troops, and they were already maintaining a presence there before Russian forces reached the location. While the Ukrainians had been preparing for an attack, they did not know exactly when this attack would come. The airport had already been garrisoned with between 200 to 300 National Guard troops after Ukraine received the intel from the CIA, but these were mostly made up of conscripts. Very few professional, experienced soldiers had manned the airport at this stage, and the Ukrainians had also underestimated just how much firepower the Russians would send their way. They had planned for a smaller scale invasion of special forces, not a full-scale airborne assault. But nevertheless, the Ukrainian military were able to more securely garrison the airport on the 23rd of February, after intel from banker and intelligence officer Denis Kiryev claimed that the Russians would launch their attack the following day. Sure enough, Kiryev was correct, and the Russians planned to capture both Antonov Airport and Hostomel, before quickly moving on to Kiev using airlifted heavy weapons. It was reportedly the Russians' plans to have everything completed quickly, forming a tight hold on the Hostomel region so that an assault on Kiev could take place promptly. Putin reportedly believed that the initial assault on Hostomel would throw Ukraine into disarray, causing the collapse of the military and the subsequent installation of a Russian puppet government. The reality, however, will be much different. Ukraine had prepared well for the assault on Hostomel, and as a result, they were not taken entirely by surprise when the invasion began on the 24th of February. By the time the Russians had arrived, Antonov Airport had been reinforced with additional ground troops, tanks, and armoured vehicles. The first contact of the Russo-Ukrainian War took place a little after 6 AM on the 24th of February 2022. Russia commenced their invasion by launching 4 Novator caliber missiles at Antonov Airport, as well as the neighbouring National Guard base that had been supplying the airport with troops. While these missiles made contact, they did not damage the garrison that Ukrainians had established around the airport. The next wave of the offence, however, proved to be slightly more challenging. By 9:30 AM, Russia had launched a formation of around 30 helicopters that would serve to supply the area around Antonov Airport with both troops and supplies. Now Russia had begun to bring in by air between 200 and 300 airborne troops, which were escorted by Ka-52 and Mi-24 attack helicopters. But this alone was not enough to break down the Ukrainian defences that had been prepared at the airport. The Russians also jammed their enemy's radar, stopping them from detecting the ensuing helicopter assault. Ukrainian ground forces, however, were able to intercept the Russian forces as they began to descend on the airport via the Dnieper River, pelting the choppers with small arms fire and portable guided missiles. This initial wave of defense was successful, and the Ukrainians on the ground managed to bring down 2 of the Russian attack helicopters. Now a landing of Russian troops would be more difficult to safely execute. A second wave of helicopters, however, soon emerged through the thick cloud cover obscuring the surrounding countryside. Ukrainian National Guardsmen took to the anti-aircraft guns at the northern end of the airport's garrison, and they prepared to intercept them. This second wave of choppers arrived at the Antonov Airport at around 11 AM, and aimed to clear the area so that ground troops could land. A barrage of rockets was fired from these helicopters onto the Ukrainian defences that surrounded the airport, and while the garrison held, some succeeded in destroying defensive positions around the site. This brought the Russian forces just enough time to land their troops on the outskirts of Hostomel, and soon enough their soldiers were closing in. The National Guardsmen who had been deployed to the airport found defending their position to be a difficult task. For many of them, this was the first combat that they had seen, and many were inexperienced fighters. But still, they persisted. Another Russian chopper was shot down by a guardsman by the name of Sergei Falatyuk, and the defenders forced Russian commander Captain Ivan Boldyrev to make an emergency landing when his helicopter was hit. Meanwhile, Russian forces on the ground steadily began to grow in number, and across the initial airport battle, around 700 paratroopers were lifted in. After roughly an hour of fighting, the Ukrainians had retreated, although by this stage none of them had reportedly been killed. The Russian forces steadily encircling the garrison had become too risky to handle, and as a result, their retreat allowed the invaders to take the northern end of the garrison, where the anti-aircraft guns had been successfully repelling the helicopters. By midday, the Antonov airport had been seized from Ukrainian control, and the Russian soldiers had moved in to await the arrival of fresh troops. While the Russians had successfully taken over the Antonov airport, they continued to face resistance, both from the Ukrainian forces that had retreated, as well as from local armed citizens of Hostomel. In the afternoon, those that had retreated began to shell the airport with artillery fire, and a large counterattack was orchestrated by General Valery Volozhny. Under Volozhny, the 72nd Mechanized Brigade, with support from the 4th Rapid Reaction Brigade and Ukrainian Air Force, began to harass Russian positions at the newly taken airport. The Russians responded by sending in 2 Sukhoi Su-25s, a jet designed for providing air support to ground soldiers, which soon found themselves fending against Ukrainian Sukhoi Su-24s and MiG-29s. The Ukrainian military soon surrounded the airport in an attempt to take it back from the Russian invaders. They succeeded in pushing the Russians back by the evening of the 24th of February, and Russian airlifters that were supposed to be providing reinforcements were forced instead to abandon their mission. Moreover, the Russian troops that were holding the airport were now retreating into the surrounding countryside to regroup. The Ukrainians found additional support at this stage in the form of the soldiers of the Georgian National Legion. They proceeded to chase the retreating Russian soldiers in their vehicles, running them down as they attempted to reach the forests. This would mean that the Antonov airport was now back in Ukrainian hands. But exactly for how long? By the following morning, Russian mechanized ground forces had appeared at the outskirts of the airport once more. Having marched from Belarus, they had managed to cut down the Ukrainian defences at the town of Ivankiv, despite fierce resistance, and they now began to finish what the first wave of attackers had started. Combined with air assaults, these ground forces slowly began to enter the airport, breaking through the remnants of the outer defences and fighting their way in to face the Ukrainians, who had claimed their position back just a few hours earlier. Over the course of that morning, the airport quickly changed hands once more. According to Russian sources, 200 Ukrainians were killed in this assault, while not a single Russian lost their life. Both Ukrainian sources and international journalists, however, have challenged this claim. But what is clear is that the Russians soon moved into the Antonov airport, and they secured it for themselves. The Ukrainian Ministry of Defense soon claimed that the Russians had damaged the airport so badly in their assault that it could not be of any use in the upcoming battle against Kiev. While they officially confirmed later on the 25th of February that they were no longer in control of the Antonov airport, the Russians began to move on to the next logical position in order to minimize any Ukrainian resistance in the area, the town of Hostomel itself. Fighting began later that day in the outskirts of Hostomel, closest to the airport. Ukrainian ground forces within the town began to fight the Russians as they advanced, while Ukraine's Mi-24 helicopters sent forth barrages of rockets to batter enemy soldiers and their tanks. The Ukrainians were successful in defending Hostomel from attack during these early stages of the offensive on the town, and they managed to take out several Russian tanks in the process. Over the course of the remaining day, fighters on both sides attempted to press forward. The Russians marched on seemingly unfazed, while the Ukrainians met them with fire and fury. During the assault, Russian forces managed to destroy the Irpin Bridge, a major route into Kiev that connects Hostomel with the capital. Moreover, Putin's plans for a potential assault on Kiev were beginning to unfold in the newly captured airport. The Ukrainians had gained intel late on the 25th of February that a unit of 1,500 Kadyrovites had moved into the Antonov airport to eliminate Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in what would have been a calculated assassination attempt. Kadyrovites are Chechen detachments of Russian military organizations, including the National Guard and the Ministry of Defense. According to the intel that the Ukrainians had received, these men were, quote, the best fighters of the Chechen Republic, and they were well equipped to move on Zelensky now that the airport had been taken over. From the Ukrainians' perspective, something had to be done about this post-haste. As was revealed, the Kadyrovites had been deployed to the airport in order to assassinate Zelensky, and they might have been successful had they not been intercepted by the Ukrainians that were defending Hostomel from attack. Kadyrovites had been assembling a massive convoy of tanks on the outskirts of Hostomel, but they were soon met with heavy fire from the Ukrainian National Guard and the Special Operations Center of the Security Service of Ukraine, colloquially known as Alpha Group. Drones spotted the movement of the Kadyrovites initially, and the assassination plot was soon foiled. According to Ukrainian sources, the National Guard and Alpha Group managed to eliminate 56 Russian tanks as they entered formation, reportedly killing hundreds of Kadyrovites in the process. Amongst those killed, according to the Ukrainians, was Magomed Tushayev, a lieutenant colonel amongst the Kadyrovites. The National Guard continued to target these Chechen fighters as the week persisted, reportedly eliminating hundreds more by the 28th of February. As February turned to March, Ukrainian citizens living in Hostomel watched as their town became host to a siege, with persistent artillery shelling and barrages of airstrikes launched by the invaders. The Ukrainian National Guard did what they could to minimize the effects of this constant bombardment, but unfortunately this did little to improve the conditions for those trapped within the town. As no civilian vehicles were entering or exiting Hostomel, citizens struggled to obtain food or water, and the heavy artillery fire had cut out electricity across much of the town. What's more is that the town was now running low on vital medical supplies, and with many dead or dying as a result of the conflict, disease was becoming a major risk. Humanitarian aid, while vital, was simply not an option. Russian forces reportedly began firing on ambulances, while the remaining Kadyrovites began robbing and extorting residents of Hostomel as they attempted to go about their daily business. If aid were to be delivered, those providing it could easily be targeted. The first urban combat within the centre of Hostomel took place on the 3rd of March 2022. It was reported by the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense that on that date, Ukrainian Special Forces, with the help of armed civilians, destroyed up to 20 BMD-2s and BMD-4s. These are heavily armoured, tank-like fighting vehicles that belong to the Russian airborne forces. They have powerful turrets capable of firing auto-cannon rounds. Much of the fighting against these Russian BMDs took place around Hostomel's glass factory, formerly a thriving industry which, due to the outbreak of war, had been rendered eerily silent as the armoured vehicles rolled in. The intense Ukrainian resistance managed to repel Russian forces from getting too close to the town centre during this time. Videos posted by Ukrainian forces to social media began to show heavily damaged BMDs and dead Russian soldiers scattered across Hostomel's roads. Later, on the 3rd of March, as Russian forces began to emerge from Antonov Airport to take another shot at assaulting the town's outskirts. Ukrainian snipers, operating from vantage points in the town centre, managed to take out a significant target. Major General Andrei Sukovetsky, in command of the 7th Guards Mountain Air Assault Division of the Airborne Forces, would fall as one Ukrainian marksman took his shot. Reports of Sukovetsky's death will be obscured by the chaos of war having commenced, and some reports would claim that he was killed during the siege of Mariupol, an instance of the Russo-Ukrainian War that we have also covered on this channel recently. It is believed, however, with a greater degree of accuracy, that Sukovetsky was indeed killed in action at the Battle of Hostomel, and not during the siege of Mariupol. Russian forces entered the centre of Hostomel once more during the following morning on the 4th of March 2022. This time, the Ukrainians had come prepared, and they destroyed yet another Russian BMD with BM-21 Grad rockets, mounted onto the backs of military vehicles. Reportedly, multiple Russian soldiers were also taken out by these rockets, as the Ukrainians continued to fiercely defend their territory. Meanwhile, closer to the airport, where another unit of Kadavarites had been stationed, Chechen forces were being overwhelmed by Ukrainian fire, and their ammunition, weapons and vehicles were claimed by the defenders. By the end of the 4th of March, Ukraine had declared that Hostomel Center had been successfully taken from advancing Russian forces. Supposedly, the Russians had lost 50 men in the skirmishes which took place that day, and a great deal of intel and equipment had also been seized from their bodies. While the town centre was clear of Russian invaders, the Antonov Airport was not, and the day had not truly been won. In the evening, Major Valery Viktorovich Chibiniev, a Ukrainian sniper commander of the 79th Air Assault Brigade, was killed near the Antonov Airport as Russian forces from the 31st Guards Air Assault Brigade closed in to reinforce their newly captured territory. Soldiers from the 31st Guards then closed in on the town centre once more, and they captured a large residential building complex on the outskirts of the town, where they took over 40 civilians as hostages. Amongst the captives was Ukrainian journalist Ruslan Vinichenko, who had been reporting on the situation in Hostomel when the Russians took over. He reported that there were 60 others being held in the complex alongside him, and that a further 90 had been captured by the Russians in the next building over. Vinichenko claimed that Russian soldiers had moved in on his building complex and were looting and stealing from Ukrainian homes, as well as confiscating electronics in order to limit contact with the outside world. The Russians began to corral their hostages into the basements of the apartment complexes, where civilians would only be permitted to leave to obtain water or to smoke. Some, he reported, began spreading false rumours of Ukrainian losses in major cities, a tactic of demotivation that had been reported in other regions also affected in the early days of the war, such as Mariupol. While Vinichenko and his partner were able to escape Russian captivity in the apartment complex when a car had picked them up, others were not so lucky. Reportedly, a week into having taken the hostages, Russian soldiers announced plans to move those that they had captured to Belarus. Reports of Russian soldiers taking civilians to locations inside or adjacent to Russia were not uncommon in these early days. And again, there were those from Mariupol who reported that civilians attempting to flee the besieged city were also taken to camps on the other side of the Russian border. By the 5th of March, Russian soldiers managed to move further into Hostomel, taking prisoners and pushing back the Ukrainian resistance as they proceeded to capture the town. The situation was not looking bright for the Ukrainian National Guard, or for those who found themselves unable to escape the settlement as the Russians moved in. The question quickly became whether the Russians could keep Hostomel for themselves, to be used as a springboard for their intentions to advance on Kiev. When the Russians took over Hostomel, they began to prevent any civilians from escaping the area. The military positioned themselves both around the outskirts and in the center, and for the Ukrainians trapped within, it seemed like the town had been lost for good. On the 7th of March, Russian soldiers reportedly killed Yuri Prilipko, who at the time was serving as the mayor of Hostomel. Prilipko had been killed whilst orchestrating the delivery of aid to his town's residents, and upon his death, his body had been booby-trapped in order to kill others who would attempt to bury him. It looked as though the Russians would get their way too, until a lone Russian soldier disarmed the trap, as a local priest attempted to bury Prilipko's body. This same soldier is reported to have helped the priest to transport the mayor's corpse onto a wheelbarrow so it could be taken to the church. In March of 2022, Ukrainian news organization Texty interviewed a survivor of the chaos who chose to remain anonymous. He reported that amongst the Russian soldiers stationed in Hostomel were more Kadyrovites, who had been executing civilians without trial. He said, quote, "Now there are many Kadyrovites all over Hostomel. In some areas there are more of them, in some less. But in fact, they have now spread throughout the city. They drive around the city in their cars, shoot into the air, and if they don't like someone, they can shoot them. They shot one of the residents of a private house because they first broke his fence. He came out to look. They ordered him to give them food, and when the man refused the occupiers, they simply shot him and drove on." While all this violence continued in the center of Hostomel, its citizens desperately needed support. Food and water were starting to become hard to come by, and vital medicine needed to cure the wounded was lacking. International humanitarian aid could not enter the center of Hostomel due to the position of Russian troops along its outskirts. But all was not lost for the Ukrainians. In the second week of March, several attempts would be made to take the town back from the invaders, as Ukrainian soldiers descended upon Hostomel once more. Before attempting to take the town back from the Russians, however, Ukrainian soldiers started to distribute aid to civilians wherever they could. After taking back small parts of the settlement's outskirts from the Russian troops, and from repelling a Russian retaliation on the night of the 8th of March, the soldiers' next steps were to prepare a large-scale evacuation. This evacuation began to take place during the day on the 8th of March, but removing civilians from the town proved to be difficult. The Russians continued to open fire on anybody attempting to conduct the evacuation. Wider attempts to remove citizens from the Kiev Oblast region were more successful, and by the 9th of March, around 20,000 civilians had been moved to other areas of the country. The reclamation process of Hostomel had to be a steady one. Russian forces covered the area, making it difficult for Ukrainian soldiers to make territorial gains. This was made even more difficult by the constant arrival of Russian helicopters, which came delivering fresh troops and supplies to the invaders. While the evacuation attempts subtly continued throughout the course of the week, the Ukrainians began to attempt an offensive against the Russians stationed in Hostomel. First, on the 13th of March, they struck a bridge just outside the town centre as Russian troops were attempting to cross, killing several soldiers and destroying the bridge in the process. On the 16th, the Ukrainian National Guard amassed to launch a series of wide-scale counterattacks against the Russians who had taken Hostomel. They started by barraging Russian positions with artillery fire, causing them to scatter, before moving in and making major territorial reclamations in the center of Hostomel. Andriy Nevetov, the head of the Kiev Region Police, noted that it was this successful counter that stopped the Russians from launching their planned direct attack on the capital, which would likely have gone ahead in a matter of weeks. By the 1st of April 2022, it was reported by the Kiev Regional Military Administration that Russian troops had been driven out of their position in Hostomel and the Antonov airport. What seemed like a foregone Russian victory in these early days of the war proved to be short-lived. From the Russian perspective, their major shot at taking Ukraine's capital had crumbled before their eyes, and any underestimations that they had had of their enemy were quickly quashed. The Ukrainian counterattacks had proved too much for the Russian military to withstand, and as a result of fierce Ukrainian resistance, they were forced to abandon their newly claimed route to the capital. Hostomel was heavily affected by the ravages of war. The airport, along with many buildings in the town centre, such as churches, nurseries and shops, were left wrecked and contorted by artillery fire, while the roads became strewn with the hollowed-out shells of destroyed military vehicles. Tanks, transport trucks, BMDs, and also the world-famous Antonov An-225 Maria cargo plane lie shattered while the war wages on. Despite the damage done to the town, however, Hostomel serves as a powerful symbol of resistance for the Ukrainian people. This unassuming countryside town was ultimately able to successfully defend its position against a major global superpower. While the odds were overwhelmingly stacked against the inexperienced members of the Ukrainian National Guard, and what looked like a Russian victory that would quickly sweep the area turned out in favor of the Ukrainians. Following the Battle of Hostomel and the conflict at Antonov Airport, Russian Deputy Minister of Defense Alexander Fomin announced that Russian troops would withdraw from the wider Kiev area. Those retreating did so quickly, destroying their own equipment so that Ukrainian forces could not claim it for themselves. However, a great deal of Russian equipment was left intact and claimed by Ukrainian forces at earlier stages in the battle, which has only allowed them to bolster their defences. It is not currently known exactly how many casualties occurred on either side of the battle, and this information is made harder to obtain with the wider conflict still ongoing. Both sides claim that hundreds of opposing soldiers were killed across the Hostomel and Antonov battles in their entirety, but in reality, both sides are thought to have suffered heavy losses. A great deal of armoured vehicles and helicopters were lost by the Russian army as Ukrainian forces defended their territory, and the battle has gone down in history as a major success for the Ukrainians as a result. Had they not managed to defend their position in the way that they did, the war may now indeed have been over for the Ukrainians. But as of early 2026, Hostomel still belongs to Ukraine, and it is undergoing reconstruction as its residents attempt to restore it to its former charm and glory. The effects of the battle are still visible, and the civilians affected by the invasion have suffered as a result. But with enough time and space afforded to the Ukrainian people, Hostomel may well return to its pre-war state once again. The same can also be said for the Antonov airport. The damage of the shelling and the helicopter fire have not been fully repaired to this date, and damaged planes can still be seen littering its runways and airfields. Perhaps soon, though, the airport will resume its role as a major cargo hub for Ukrainian industry. Volodymyr Zelensky himself, towards the beginning of 2025, noted in an interview with Italian publication Il Foglio that, quote, "If Kiev had fallen in February 2022, we would have lost the war." Instead, however, the conflict rages on, with the Ukrainians having bought themselves enough time to defend their capital city, as the Russians continue to attempt offensives across the nation. It's still difficult to tell which way the Russo-Ukrainian war will sway, with new United States-backed peace plans hanging in the balance. The bombardment of Ukrainian cities and troops continues unabated, which has led Zelensky to comment on how Vladimir Putin is not serious about any impeding peace negotiations. For now, however, Ukraine's resistance remains as fierce as it was in these early days of the war, and only time will reveal what might unfold next. Thank you for watching today's video. If you found it informative, please leave a like or a comment down below. All of our content, from the research and scriptwriting to the editing and narration, is completely human-driven, without the use of AI. So if you want to support our channel, consider subscribing and use the bell icon to get notifications on when the next Wars of the World video is released. Thank you for watching.